Hey guys, welcome to my channel. My name is ReadingBear and I hope you are ready for some more stories. And today, we'll take a look at some new malicious compliance content. If you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comment. And now, let's dive right into the stories.
First one is titled, "This Job Stinks." This is my father's story from many years ago from when he worked with a surveying crew for the city. I think they work in groups of 3. One day, their van broke down and they were told there was nothing available for them to drive. Just take the bus for the rest of the week, while repairs are being done. They did, out of totally non-malicious compliance. It was very inconvenient but they made it work. After the end of the second week and no van, they complained. Their manager tried to intervene but his boss basically yelled, saying the parts are too expensive and he didn't want to hear taxpayer complaints about wasting money. He wouldn't, because his job is too far removed from that. The bus was free for city workers on the clock, so it saved his department money. This didn't sit well with my dad's crew and their opportunity for maliciousness came quickly. Surveying is often taking elevations of various benchmarks scattered around the city. Sometimes, however, they got work orders to take invert elevations of sewer lines. Usually, it's just one worker that has to go down the manhole to dip the stick. But they all made sure to pack rubber gear for everyone that day, and they all went down, splashing around a bit more than necessary. They waited until close to rush hour before taking the bus back to their base yard. And made sure to tell everyone who they were, why they were on the bus, and how if they didn't like it, to complain to the mayor. Well, the passengers certainly did raise a stink. And none of those complaints had anything to do with wasting taxpayer money. They had a van very soon after that. Next one is titled, "Don't Walk on Your Property. You Got It." This one goes back to the previous neighborhood our family lived in. It was a really nice quiet horseshoe-shaped street but it had no sidewalks. When my wife and I would walk the dogs and our kids, we would have to walk in the street. This was not a problem unless a car came and we would have the kids step aside into the grass to stay out of the street while the car passed. The neighborhood was built in the 80s and many residents are original owners. Mostly nice but of course we have some nasty humanoids among them. One neighbor in particular seems to always have to say something mean when we go by. She is a deacon at the church my family goes to and is the type to be religious for face value only. One day in particular she yelled at us for allowing our kids to step in her grass, while avoiding a car in the road, and I told her that they were just stepping aside until the car passed. She got overly angry and started spraying a hose at us and screaming like a banshee. We hurried the kids away and told them that they did nothing wrong and from now on we will walk on the other side of the street. About 2 weeks later, her and her husband got a new shed installed at their house and had to have the property surveyed for it. As I drove by I noticed something. The front property boundary was about 10 feet back from the road. The houses on their side of the street all day a little farther back. I had a friend who does surveying come out and do our property and sure enough our boundary was about 3 feet from the road. We did some digging through the archives at City Hall and found that the neighborhood was permitted and designed to have a sidewalk that ran the length of the horseshoe on her side of the street. The 10 feet right-of-way was designed to have curbing, grass, and then a sidewalk. So I did what any sane person would do in this situation and I contacted the township to have a sidewalk put in. The township notified all residents of the request and held an open hearing for it during a township meeting. Most of the neighbors showed up in support of it, most didn't care, but that nasty woman showed up to protest it and raise all hell. A month later they began excavating for the sidewalk and when they got to her house, she had planted a big landscape piece with flowers and shrubs and a tree right in the way. The township told her to remove it, she didn't, they fined her and removed it themselves. The best part of the story is that 2 weeks after the sidewalk was finished and in, we listed our house and moved to another neighborhood. She still makes nasty remarks to my mother at church and we drive by her house while visiting our old neighbors every now and then. Next one is titled, "You Want Me to Keep Digging? You Got It." Bit of an odd one, but I'm trying to rest after all this back-breaking malicious compliance. Figured I'd share. Since the pandemic started, I've been living with my sister and my parents at home. I'm pretty grateful that I get along with my parents and my sis, and things have been pretty smooth sailing given the circumstances over the past year or so. That being said, my dad is pretty my way or the highway with most things, always very controlling when it comes to keeping the house clean and the backyard manicured. He bought a lawnmower, trimmer and blower this past spring, and tidies around the house probably twice a week. I love him, but goddamn does he need things to be clean, and will not waste an opportunity to complain things are messy and ask us to do mundane tasks, refill the toilet paper when we have many extra rolls, etc. I'm pretty understanding, and my dad's just a little on the neurotic side, but he's just so uppity about it that it's hard not to get annoyed at. So a couple weeks back, my dad notices the flower bed in the backyard isn't doing so hot. Or rather, it's doing too hot. The trees above give pretty normal shade most of the garden but lets the sun absolutely bake the flower bed. Not much you can do about it, just a small quirk of the backyard landscaping. My dad can't look at that without thinking, this needs to be solved. But instead of planting a sun-loving plant, he decides it's the soil's fault. Somehow, he makes the connection that the soil might have been salted by accident or something, and my dad asks me to dig out the dying flowers, clean out the soil, put in new soil, and replant the same dying flowers. I'm a bit confused because it's pretty obvious the sun is the problem, but once my dad decides he solved a problem, it's solved. So after a bit of an argument, I cut my losses, except that I'm living here rent-free, and go clear the soil, repot the flowers and give them a nice watering. 1 week later and the flowers are dead. My dad gets it in his head that somehow I didn't get rid of the old, salty soil, and after some more arguing over how the sun works, I'm off to Home Depot for more flowers and soil to plant new flowers in new soil. This next batch holds for maybe 2 weeks, until the inevitable heat death of the flower bed comes about, and my dad is left with a second batch of crisp flowers. Yet again, it's my fault for not getting rid of that darn salty soil, so he says, "Big Chip, do not stop digging until you get rid of every last inch of old soil." Here's the thing. Some of our flower beds are placed over canvas fabric, which separates it from the ground soil, a geotextile fabric, to keep things level, which is what my dad thought I was digging down to. This flower bed was not one of them. There is no bottom. My dad leaves to go for a bike ride, and I start digging. And keep digging. Still digging. Lunch. Back to digging. My mom and sis decided to chill outside with me, my mom telling me this was ridiculous and my sister cheerleading me forward. My dad gets back home before dinner and I'm about waist deep in an 8 feet long by 4 feet wide pit with a huge ring of soil around the edges, dirt all over the backyard. He barges over, smoke coming out of his nostrils, yelling at how I'm destroying his garden, asking what the hell I was doing. I just said, well, I don't think I can get rid of all the old soil, but a couple more days of this and I think we'll be pretty safe. My sis starts laughing her ass off and my dad has absolutely no recollection of his words until my sis has to remind him of what he said. Looking forward to tomorrow, when my dad's gonna have to help me refill the pit and come with me to a local garden center to pick out some sunflowers. Next one is titled, "Maintenance Won't Fix the Problem, so Fix It for Them." Just some background before we get to the real story. Everyone's college experience is different, but my freshman year was unique because the university was located in the heart of a city and didn't have a typical campus layout. Instead, the university rented out some very old apartment buildings to use for housing. The rooms were all studio layout with beds and a small kitchens that included a stove and medium-sized refrigerator since the school didn't provide meals. The refrigerator is where the true story begins. My roommate and I were returning from winter break which lasted about 3 full weeks, and when we entered our room for the first time since leaving, we were greeted with a horrible smell of rotting meat. Apparently early on in the break, the nearly empty apartment building lost power and our old refrigerator couldn't handle the surge to kick back on once the power was back and essentially died out. Unfortunately for us, the only thing that was in our fridge was some beers, condiments, and some frozen meat in the freezer which my roommate had purchased. Obviously, no one was to blame for the incident, and we contacted maintenance to put in a request for the refrigerator to be removed and a new one brought in. Easy enough. We cleaned out the fridge the best we could and patiently waited for it to be replaced. A few days go by and we are still living with this nasty smelly refrigerator without any updates on when it would be replaced. My roommate contacts maintenance and they explain they are aware of the situation and will fix it soon. We think this understandable, it's a large building and a lot goes on. Days continue to go by and still no maintenance. We contact them again and are greeted with a hostile, "We have a lot of requests, we'll get to it." Needless to say, they were in no rush to get to it. 2 more weeks go by and the smell has maintained its full strength. My roommate has given up and started staying in another room with some friends. All of our additional requests are ignored and our calls are met with an answering machine. After a final attempt to contact them with no response, I sat and stared at the empty refrigerator and had an epiphany. Maintenance was clearly too busy to help, so I figured I would do them a favor and relocate the fridge for them. I opened our door and dragged the clumsy, smelly hunk of metal and plastic out to the middle of the hallway, directly in front of the elevators. Every single student or visitor would be greeted by the lovely aroma we had been living with for nearly 3 weeks. It didn't take very long for the complaints to pile up and the refrigerator was gone by the end of the day. Our new refrigerator was delivered the following morning and our future requests were handled promptly. Sadly, the smell lingered in the halls for a while and in my memory forever. Next one is titled, "Only Management Can Grant Overtime? Sure thing, boss." I worked as an assistant in a team of 3 for a broker's office. When I got hired, I was told that since it was a family business, everyone was expected to make sacrifices, which sometimes meant that overtime was needed. As I came to learn, sometimes was just their way of saying every other day. 2 months in, I realized that most people in the company worked at least 5 to 10 hours of overtime a week, completely unpaid. After a particularly hard 10-hour day, for the 4th day in a row, I went into my boss's office and asked how overtime requests worked. She mentioned that the rule was, if we give you a task that needs overtime, we will let you know. She then clarified that unless she oked that overtime was needed at the beginning of a client request task, then we could assume we would not be paid any overtime. For the next week, I would receive extremely complicated client requests from our boss that would force me to stay in the office until 7 to 8 p.m. We start at 8:30 a.m. When I asked our boss, she would just say, "I don't know what to tell you, I did not okay the overtime." Okay then, so it's gonna be like that. For the next month, every time I got a client request, I would analyze how long it would take. Most of the time, if I got a request before 2 p.m., I would be able to complete whatever they asked for before my scheduled time to leave, 5 p.m. If I got a very complicated task, then I would probably need to finish it in the morning. Of course, my boss never stated that any client request, task required overtime. These would go like this. Me. "Oh, this looks fairly complicated." Boss looks at the clock reading 3:45 p.m. Boss. "Yup, sure is. Thanks, my name." Me. "So nothing special about this? Okay, then." As soon as 5 p.m. struck, I was out the door. Oh, client really needed this done today? Well, I guess it could wait, seeing as boss did not mention overtime. Oh? Client in a different time zone was pissed because nobody picked up the phone after 5 p.m.? Well, I sure am glad boss stayed until 9 p.m. solving his request. What's that? It's 4:30 p.m. and a client will lose hundreds of dollars if their request is not solved by tonight. Sure thing. I am not authorized to work overtime, but I will put you through to my boss. In the 5.5 months that I was there, I never once heard my boss grant anyone overtime. I guess in her mind you can expect workers to work 60-hour weeks, come in on the weekend, but not compensate them because I did not approve it. Last one is titled, "You're firing me because the uniform you forced only me to wear flatters me? Okay, bye." My first job out of school was as a language teacher in a private school, and it sounds like it's straight out of a fiction book. I was employed to teach grades 6 to 9. However, because I was the only teacher for that language, the owner begged me to teach grade 1 to 5 when I had any time to spare. I wasn't paid for the extra work. I taught each of the classes I was employed to teach, twice a week, and the other classes once a week. Aside that, lunch duties were added to my work, so I hardly sat all day. The school had a preschool at a different location, and all the teachers there wore uniforms. The preschool workers, all females, were the only ones required to wear uniforms. I was the only female teacher on the grade 1 to 9 staff. One day, the owner calls me to her office and asks me why I'm not in a uniform like the preschool staff. I tell her no one informed me about wearing uniforms in my department, and also the male teachers do not wear uniforms. She gets slightly angry and orders me to sew one with my own money. I try to protest, but I see there's no way getting through to her. My parents convince me to let it go and sew one. When she sees me in the uniform, she goes off about how figure-flattering the uniform is on me, tells me I'm trying to seduce the boys, and calls me a prostitute. She orders me to sew a new one or don't come back. My uniform was not short, way below the knee, didn't show cleavage, nor was it tight. I ignore her and she fires me a week later, while I'm in the middle of a class. I just packed my stuff and left. The next day, the principal calls me to tell me the owner is asking why I didn't show up that day. Duh, you fired me. She calls me herself and orders me to come back to work, talking about how do I expect the kids to eat lunch. Good luck finding a donkey like me to work for that pittance. I went back though, but not without double my pay. I then quit the next month. Edit. I'm glad the whole ridiculousness of my story makes its authenticity doubtful, but it's not uncommon behavior in sole proprietorship schools where I come from. Not every country in the world is an utopia for workers. Thanks for listening.